Hi folks, Jonathan here again with my 5th progress report into the Upton area, and this time I'm focusing on the memorial that used to be in St James's Church, which remembered the dead of the First World War. In terms of death and destruction, the Great War was perhaps one of the most devastating conflicts of modern times, given the sheer scale at which soldiers and sailors lost their lives. What is more, it is estimated that well over 500,000 military personnel either have no known grave, or if they have a grave, have not been identified. And further, research into the lives of British fallen men suffered another somewhat tragic loss, in that 60% of the service records of these soldiers and sailors were damaged or destroyed because of bombing during the Second World War. Consequently, discovering what happened to these people is not necessarily straightforward. Nonetheless, the names of many fallen soldiers are commemorated on war memorials in churches, town squares and cemeteries in this country and around the world, and there is one in Princess Gardens on the Torquay seafront near the theatre, and there used to be the one in St James's Church in Upton, Torquay. However, that's no longer there. It was thought to be on the church hall of Upton Parish Church, St Mary Mag's, but that one is actually remembering those who went to Upton School. But with the purchase of St James's Church by the Together Church, there is a desire to reinstate a memorial of some kind to the fallen of the First World War. In the British Newspaper Archive, I have found a brief note announcing the unveiling of a memorial at St James's Upton for the 9 men who fell and were from this parish. But sadly no names are given. However, a list from the missing memorial is included in Derek Seymour's Upton, the Heart of Torquay, and it comprises 31 names. Memorials tend to just record the names, although sometimes ranks are recorded as on the Torquay Memorial, and they may be divided into services such as Army, Navy, Air Force. And there is a long heritage for such lists. The first 9 chapters of the first book of Chronicles in the Bible is basically one long list of names, sometimes interspersed with comments about a particular individual's life. But rather than just have a list of names, I have attempted to find out more about each of these men as a way of honouring their memory. This includes what regiment or ship they served in, when and where they died, and what was their possible connection to Upton and Torquay, so maybe answering why they were on St James's Church Memorial. So what follows is what I have discovered so far, but it would probably require a much longer video to do them all justice. So it's more of a summary and highlights, although given the nature of the subject, perhaps lowlights might be a better word. The list of men is shown here, and I've indicated which of them are also remembered on the Torquay Memorial. So I've given each of them their own separate slide, and they are in a general alphabetical order, but when not, it will be obvious why. So we can begin. John Armin was a private in the 1st Battalion of the Queen's Own Royal West Kent Regiment. He was wounded in November 1916, but was killed in action on the 23rd of July 1917 in France. He was 27 years old at the time. According to the pensions records, his mother, Mary Armin, lived at 85 Forest Road, and the record card has a note that says she did not wish to apply for a pension. In the 1911 census, he is recorded as living at home at 1 Princess Road, Ellacombe, and his occupation was a carman for Sutton Parcels delivery, perhaps the equivalent of the delivery drivers for Amazon, DPD and UPS, etc. these days. Sidney Ernest Baker was a sapper in the 78th Field Company of the Royal Engineers. He died on the 15th of June 1917 in France, aged 38. His dependents' pension details record that he is the husband of Florence Elizabeth Baker, living at 35 Sherborne Road. From the 1911 census, we learn that he has been married to Florence Elizabeth for 7 years, and they had 5 children. So they were aged between 4 and 13-year-olds at the time of his death. Leonard John Bastard was a private in the 4th Battalion Territorials of the Devonshire Regiment. He was killed in action on the 3rd of February 1917 in Mesopotamia, that's modern-day Iraq, and he was only 19 years old. From the pensions record, we learn that his father was John Mudge Bastard, who lived at 7 Westbourne Road. The 13-year-old Leonard was living at the same address in 1911. Alfred Chapel, or Alfred John Chapel, is something of a mystery, in that there are quite a lot of Alfred Chapels as well as Alfred John Chapels in the online military sources, and he's not actually on the Torquay Memorial. The 1911 census tells us that there was an Alfred John Chapel staying at 1 Rosary Terrace, Warborough Road, St Mary Church, and that he was a signalman on the railways, Wales. This would suggest he was working for GWR, and so may not actually have been living at home. In the 1901 census, he may have been living on Manor Road as a houseboy attendant or servant at the house of James J. Rowe, a clerk in Holy Orders in the Anglican Church. So for the moment I cannot place him in a regiment or find a time or place of death, but he may well have attended St James's Church. Thomas Chick was a Stoker First Class on HMS Defence, which was a Monitor-class armoured cruiser. He was killed at the Battle of Jutland on the 31st of May 1916, aged 24. The dependent's pension records give his mother's name as Emma Jane Chick, living in Ellacombe, Torquay, but the records are not more specific. Also, I have yet to find either of them in the 1911 census, but he did enlist in the Navy in 1913 and suffered from tonsillitis at the end of November 1914. Fred Coleman was a sergeant in the 8th Service Battalion of the Devonshire Regiment. He was killed in action on the 25th of September 1915 in France at the Battle of Louise, and at the age of 25. His widow, Louise Augusta, lived at 62 Sherborne Road. In the 1911 census, Fred was living with his parents at 8 Prospect Place, Upton, and was a gardener's assistant. And according to the Birth, Marriages and Death Register, he married Louise Augusta Miller 2 years before he was killed in the summer of 1913, and they had no children. Percy Cornish was a private in the 20th London Regiment. He was killed in action on the 1st of October 1916 in France during the Battle of the Somme at the age of 23. According to the dependent's pension records, his mother was Annie Cornish, who lived at 36 Upton Road. Apparently, she received a pension of 5 shillings from the 6th of November 1918. In 1911, Percy was living at home at 7 Hillside Cottages, Upton Road, and was a caddy boy, which is a lad who assists men in their work. Leonard Elliot was a private in the 7th Battalion of the Duke of Cornwall's Light Infantry. He died on the 16th of August 1917 during the Battle of Ypres, aged 20. The dependent's pension record tells us his mother was Mary Elliot, living at 163 Westbourne Road, and she too received a pension of 5 shillings from the 5th of March 1918. At the time of the 1911 census, he was also living at 163 Westbourne Road and was working as an errand boy for a cycle shop. Percy Endicott, or Percival Joseph Endicott, was a private in the 9th Battalion of the Devonshire Regiment. He was killed in action on the 6th of September 1916 in France at the age of 19. Interestingly, he is one of the names missing from the Torquay Memorial, but according to the dependent's pension register, his mother, Sarah Endicott, was living at 36 Upton Hill, and she too received a 5 shilling pension from March the 5th, 1917. And in the 1911 census, he is recorded as living at home at 7 Copford Terrace, Upton Hill, working as a baker's errand boy. Fred England was a private in the 2nd Battalion of the Devonshire Regiment. He was killed in action on the 18th of July 1916 in France during the Battle of the Somme, aged 21. The casualty record records his parents as William Henry and Emily England, living at 37 Westbourne Road, which is where Fred was living in 1911, and he was working as an errand boy for a chemist. Harry Field, or Henry Graham Field, was a private in the 6th Battalion of the Devonshire Regiment. He was killed in action in Mesopotamia on the 8th of March 1916, aged 25. According to the Forces War Records, his widow was Florence M. Field of 37 Heel Road, St Mary Church, Torquay. In 1911, he was living at 13 Marchwood Terrace, Upton, with his family, and was single, working as a clay digger for a brickworks. His father, Edwin Field, was a brick burner at a brickworks, so his son was obviously following in the same area of occupation. And we can find his marriage in the BMD Index, which tells us that Henry G. Field married Florence M. Vickery in the spring of 1915 in the registration district of Newton Abbot, which actually included much of Torquay at this time. So they were sadly not married for long before he was killed. Charles Hullett was a pioneer in the 3rd Provisional Company of the Royal Engineers. He was discharged on the 10th of May 1916, but sadly died of an aneurysm at home on the 29th of September of that year at the age of 55. He actually has a surviving service record that indicates that he had previously served in the 13th Hussars from 1884, but was discharged in 1896. So he must have felt he wanted to serve his king and country again. According to the Dependents' Pensions records, his widow Mary lived at 33 Parkfield Road, and they had 5 children, 3 of whom were still at home in the 1911 census. William Heathfield was a sapper in the 226th Field Company of the Royal Engineers, and we have some interesting details of his time in the army. According to the Forces War Records, on the 9th of May 1916, he was reported in the newspapers as a deserter and absentee from His Majesty's services. He had obviously returned to the army as on the 31st of October, he is reported to be suffering from scabies, having been in the field for 3 months. But he returned to active service 3 days later on the 2nd of November. Sadly, he is then reported killed in action in France 12 days after that, on the 14th of November 1916, aged 29. The Dependents' Pension record gives the name of his widow as Mary, who lived at 89 Helen Road, St Mary Church, Torquay, but I think that's meant to be 89 Heel Road, really. He had married Mary Parnell in 1911, and the reason for him being reported absence is probably because Mary was pregnant with their 4th child, Frederick, who was born in July 1916, and perhaps he wanted to see her. One wonders if William ever saw his youngest son. Mary subsequently remarried and became Mary Cutts, living at 3 Hillview Terrace, Sherborne Road. Albert Isaac was a private in the 2nd Battalion of the Devonshire Regiment. And he's one of the men that I've had difficulty tracing, because although the Dependents' Pension record indicates he was killed in action on the 7th of February 1915, it doesn't give any location, although the 2nd Battalion was on the Western Front in France in that year. His parents, Henry and Bessie Isaac, are recorded as living at 185 Lymington Road, before later moving to 202 Lymington Road. According to the 1911 census, Henry and Bessie had married 32 years earlier, had 13 children, 8 of whom were still alive and 3 were still at home, but Albert was not one of them. I've also not found him in previous censuses, so I'm not sure of his age. The pension records also reveal that Albert had a brother Henry, who was a stoker on HMS Seagull, a torpedo gunboat. who was sadly killed on the 3rd of September 1918 when the Seagull collided with a merchant ship. So it's a puzzle why Albert is on the memorial, but his brother isn't, although they are both on the Torquay Memorial. James Jarvis was a private in the Royal Marine Light Infantry based on HMS Monmouth, a Monmouth-class armoured cruiser. And he was killed in action on the 1st of November 1914 when the Monmouth was involved in the Battle of Coronel, which is off the coast of Chile, and he was aged 22. Apparently he enlisted in Plymouth in February 1913, so before the war began. And in the pensions records, his father is recorded as living at 224 Lymington Road, while a second record has his mother living at 21 Temperance Street. In the 1911 census, James is living with his parents at 1 Oak Cottage, Lower Union Lane, and he is working as an errand boy. So perhaps joining the Marines 2 years later appealed to him a little bit more than doing menial tasks. As a break from the alphabetical order, Henry Windeat was also on HMS Monmouth as a petty officer, so he was killed on the same day as James Jarvis. In fact, the ship sank with all hands, which was over 700 men. The pensions record tells us his widow Elizabeth was living at 10 Parkfield Road, and they had one child, John Henry, born on the 26th of April 1911. I have not found Henry in the 1911 census, but his wife Elizabeth was at 18 Prospect Place, Parkfield Road, the home of her parents, Thomas and Susan Whiteaway. She would have been very near the end of her pregnancy at the time, the census having been taken just 3 weeks beforehand. Henry is also not in the 1901 census, but he did marry Elizabeth Whiteaway in late 1902. Philip Joint was a driver for the 13th Division Signal Company of the Royal Engineers. He died on the 28th of February 1917 at the age of 26, probably in Baghdad in Mesopotamia. There are no pension record details, but in the 1911 census he is a boarder living at 4 Dazen Cottages, the home of William Henry and Philia Tippett, and he is a vanman, which would explain possibly his role as a driver in the signals company. Interestingly, he is staying with the parents of William Tippett. And William Henry Tippett was an electrical artificer, 3rd class on HMS Benbow, an Iron Duke class battleship. He died in active service on the 2nd of May 1916, aged 26. The dependent's pension record records his mother's name as Philia Tippett of 4 Dazen Cottages. However, in the 1911 census, while his parents are in Torquay with Philip Joint, William is living at 85 Hamilton Street, Keyham, Devonport, with his uncle and aunt, Frederick and Caroline Richards, his uncle being a chief stoker. William's occupation is an engine fitter in the dockyards, which ties in with the force's war record that he enlisted in the Navy in 1911. Frederick William Linton was a stoker first class on the HMS Queen Mary, a Lion-class battlecruiser, and another name missing from the Torquay Memorial. Derek Seymour records the spelling of his surname as Liten rather than ERN. He was killed on the 31st of May 1916, aged 33, at the Battle of Jutland, when the HMS Queen Mary was hit and sank during the engagement. In the 1911 census records, Fred was on the HMS Essex, a Monmouth-class armoured cruiser. However, it turns out that Fred is the stepson of Thomas Start Scott, who happens to be the father of William Scott. And so we come to William G. Scott, or WGL Scott, also known as William George Linton Scott. He was a private in the 14th Battalion of the Gloucestershire Regiment. He was killed in action on the 24th of May 1916 in France, aged 19. The pensions record, as found on the Fold 3 website, have the details for Fred Linton and William Scott on the same record card, which indicates that Thomas Scott lived at 5 Brunswick Terrace. To lose 2 sons in May 1916 would have made it a tragic month for Thomas Scott and his wife Bessie. But the tragedy is actually even worse, as in the previous year, on the 25th of September 1915, another of Thomas's sons, Ernest Edward, of the 8th Battalion Devonshire Regiment, had been killed in action in France. Ernest Edward's widow lived in Exeter, which would explain why he isn't on the St James Church Memorial. We now come to Arthur Henry Luxton, who is sadly another man I am having difficulty locating in the online records. In the 1911 census, he is the son of Henry and Clara Luxton, who are the proprietors of the Upton Vale Hotel, and he is 13 years old and was born in Ottery St Mary. So, apart from his listing on the Torquay War Memorial as a private in the army, there is little else I can actually say about him. Charlie Pack, or Charles Herbert Pack, was a corporal in the 14th Battalion of the Argyll and Southern Highlanders. He died of his wounds on the 24th of August 1916 in France at the age of 24. The force's war record indicates that his parents were William Henry and Maria Pack, living at Malvern, 22 Lower Sherburn Road, and the same address is given in the dependents' pension records. I have yet to discover him in the 1911 census, although his parents and siblings were then living at 16 Lower Sherburn Road. He is aged 8 in the 1901 census, and the family was then living at 15 Marlborough Terrace. Information on a separate record on the Forces War website suggests C.H. Pack was a railway porter for North Eastern Railway, living in Plessey, which is actually near Blythe in Northumberland. So that's very possibly a different C.H. Pack. William James Rendell was a private in the 8th Service Battalion of the Devonshire Regiment. He died of his wounds on the 6th of August 1916, although he was at home. According to the pensions records, his widow Rosetta Alice was living in 11 Days on Cottages, Upton, so along the street from the Tippett family, and William and Rosetta had 3 children. Harry, who those records note was born before wedlock in August 1908, George born in September 1912, and Lawrence born in January 1916. The 1911 census has William at home with his stepfather and mother, James and Maria Stone, and he's single and an off-bearer in a brickworks. Turns out that he married Rosetta Gibbons in 1912, and the pension records also indicate that Rosetta remarried and became Rosetta Beasley of 29 West Hill Avenue, St Mary Church. Frederick John Routley was a corporal, or lance sergeant, in the 1st Battalion of the Devonshire Regiment. He was killed in action on the 24th of October 1914 in France, aged 30. The pension records indicate that his widow was Florence Mabel Routley of 30 Upton Road and that they had 1 child. Interestingly, there is a record of a declaration by Florence which says, "I, Florence Mabel Routley, do solemnly and sincerely declare that I was lawfully married at Upton Church on the 15th of April 1911 to 7437 Lance Sergeant Frederick John Routley, C Company, 1st Devon Regiment, who died at Givenchy on the 24th of October 1914. The declaration indicates that they did not have any children, although later it seems that Florence adopted a child, Frederick George, which gave her a 5-shilling increase in the pension, so she was then getting 10 shillings and sixpence. We now come to Vincent, or Vincenzo Spacagna, who was a private in the 9th Service Battalion of the Devonshire Regiment. He was killed in action on the 7th of May 1917 in France, aged 19. The pension records indicate that his parents were Ernesto and Elizabeth Spacagna, living at 31 Parkfield Road, although his father had died. According to the Forces War records, Vincenzo was born in Sevaro in Italy in 1898. But when we look at the 1911 census, we find an Ernest and Elizabeth Spacagna living at 12 Park Cottages, Parkfield Road, who had been married 6 years and had a son called Vincent, who was also only 6 years old and was born in Torquay. This is one of those situations that requires a bit of further investigation. Harold George Sugden, rather than Sugden, was actually a first engineer in the Mercantile Marine, so in the Merchant Navy rather than the Armed Forces. He's also not on the Torquay Memorial. He died on the 31st of October 1916 on the troopship SS Adriatic, aged 42. There is no indication of what happened as the SS Adriatic returned to being a passenger ship after the war. She was, or had been, a White Star liner before the war, so you could say she was a sister ship of the Titanic. In the Mercantile Marine Memorial Register, Harold is recorded as the son of Mary Sugden and the late Osgerby Sugden, and the husband of Ethel Mary Sugden, originally Moses, who lived at Hillcrest, 47 Empire Road, Torquay. I have yet to find Harold in the 1911 census, but Ethel Mary was living in Avenue Road, Torquay. She was born about 1877 in Scotland, so maybe in 1911 he was at sea. James Albert Waring was a Stoker petty officer on the HMS Arabis, an Arabis-type fleet-sweeping sloop. He was killed on the 10th of February 1916, aged 36. According to a Wikipedia entry, HMS Arabis was involved in a minesweeping exercise off the Dogger Bank during the night of 10th of February 1916, when she was encountered by a flotilla of German destroyers. A brief action followed, which led to the torpedoing and sinking of Arabis with the loss of 56 of her crew. According to the Forces War Record, James had enlisted in the Navy in 1898, and the Naval Pension Records give the name of his widow as Kitty M. Waring, who was also living at 47 Empire Road, Torquay, the same address as Ethel Sugden, although in the 1911 census she was living at 1 Westbourne Crescent, St James's Road, Upton, with 2 children, Albert, James and Catherine, aged 4 and 2 at the time. In 1911, James was recorded as living in the barracks at Keyham, Devonport, and the BMD index reveals that James married Catherine Wooden in 1902 in the registration district of Newton Abbot. Charlie Weeks, or Charles Henry Weeks, was a private in the 2nd Battalion of the Devonshire Regiment and is another soldier missing from the Torquay Memorial. He was killed in action on the 14th of April 1917 in France, aged 24. The Forces War Records indicate he enlisted in 1910, which comes from a record from December 1914, when it was reported that he was suffering from sore feet, and records he had already served for 4 years. These records also tell us that he had been wounded in May 1916, and the BMD records record that around this time he married Beatrice Finnemore in Exeter. The Forces War Records also tells us that Beatrice was living in Silver Street, Honiton, but the pension record tells us that his mother is living in 2 Rose Cottage, Parkfield Road. In 1911, Charlie is living with his mother Mary, a widow, and his sister Daisy at 42 Victoria Road, Torquay. We now come to perhaps one of the saddest deaths. Percy White, or Percy James White, was a boy first class on the HMS Impregnable, a training ship at Devonport. He died in active service on the 23rd of February 1915, aged only 15. His timeline on the Lives of the First World War, which is hosted by the Imperial War Museum, adds the detail that he died of war-related sickness, although what this means is not explained. His parents were Thomas James, deceased, and Agnes Ann White of 6 Days on Cottages, Upton. They were also living there at the time of the 1911 census, and this is pretty much next door to the Tippett family. William John Wilkinson was a private in the 12th Battalion of the Suffolk Regiment, and also not on the Torquay Memorial. He died on the 8th of February 1917 in France, aged 33. The Dependents' Pensions Records say he died of bronchopneumonia contracted on active service, and that his widow, Rosina, lived at 34 Upton Hill, Torquay, with 6 children, the youngest of which was Rosina, born on the 27th of January 1916. The 1911 census has him living at 6 Cotford Terrace, Upton Hill, aged 27, with his wife Rosina, having been married for 6 years and having 4 children at that time. The BMD index indicates that William J. Wilkinson married Rosina Rablin in 1905 in the registration district of Newton Abbot. And in 1911, his occupation was a photographer and picture framer. And finally, we have Ernest Herbert Winter, who was a private in the 23rd Battalion of the Royal Fusiliers, London Regiment. He died of his wounds on the 18th of February 1917 in France, aged 21. The Force's war records tell us his parents, William and Ellen Winter, lived at 37 St James's Road, Upton, so very close to St James's Church. The 1911 census records him living with his parents at 9 Victoria Terrace, St James's Road, and gives his occupation as a domestic gardener. It seems appropriate to use the words said on Remembrance Sunday. They shall not grow old as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning we will remember them. So hopefully this video is seen as a respectful way of remembering them. And finally, since I can't resist drawing on maps, these are the streets in the vicinity of St James's Church where these men have some link to. And for the record, the main sources I've used for this research are listed here. I have actually produced a written report that provides more details, and this is with the Together Church office. In the meantime, if anyone has any further information or corrections, comments, suggestions or questions, do let me know, especially if you are a living relative, as it would be good to get the correct details of these men's lives. So meanwhile, thanks for watching.